Hello there! Today we are going back to the beginning and I'm sharing my 5 resin tips that I wish I had when I was a beginner preservation artist. If this is something you're interested in learning about, then stay tuned. Hello again and welcome back to my channel. My name is Courtney and I am a flower preservationist, educator, and business coach sharing all of my tips and tricks for building and growing your flower preservation business. For those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that my passion behind teaching the art of preservation stems from the fact that there was essentially no education about this art form when I started back in 2020. There were a few YouTube videos, but nothing that really truly dove deep into flower preservation, all the bits and pieces of it. And I started this channel, created an online course offering mentoring, coaching, and more, all to be a guide for you as you begin and progress through your journey of learning flower preservation. Today, I want to go back and share with you the 5 resin tips that I really wish I had had when I started. These were things that took me a while to learn how to figure out, and I hope that they will be helpful to you now. So, let's talk about the first one. How to choose the right resin for your project. Let's start by naming all the types of resin, shall we? There's art resin, casting resin, deep pour resin, tabletop resin, and countertop resin. And for each kind of resin, you also have 1-to-1 mixing ratios and 2-to-1 mixing ratios. Casting and deep pour resins are for your larger projects that are thicker pieces. They are formulated for multiple thicker layers to pour up to 4 inches depending on the brand of resin that you use. So you would use these these resins for all of your larger pieces. And the biggest difference between casting resins and deep pour resins is going to be the mixing ratio. Casting resins are usually a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 part A, the resin, and 1 part B, the hardener. 1-to-1 ratios in resin must be poured in thinner layers because they cure much quicker, usually within 12 to 24 hours, and they require warmer temperatures, somewhere around the mid-70s Fahrenheit to cure properly. A 2-to-1 ratio resins, 2 parts A, the resin, and 1 part B, the hardener, can be poured in thicker layers, and they can take longer to cure, usually 48 to 72 hours, and they work better in cooler environments, usually around the mid to high 60s. Fahrenheit, of course. Generally speaking, casting resins are easier to work with than deep pours. Now your art resins and tabletop or countertop resins are designed for super thin pours, and I'm talking like less than 1/8 of an inch thick, and they cure within a couple of hours. These resins are much harder when cured, and the casting and deep pour resins, than the deep pour resins that you would use these kind of resins for top coating or flood coating your pieces to finish them since they're going to be thin. But you have to be careful with these resins because they are notorious for microbubbles. And you have to make sure that you mix them slowly, pouring super thin layers, and your room and your resin temperatures are much warmer. Now the second tip is really understand the relationship between your work environment, your resin that you've chosen, and your project. There's so many factors that go into preservation using resin, and I wasn't really aware of this when I started. Your room temperature affects your resin temperature, which affects the amount of microbubbles you can have, and it can also affect the way your resin cures, and it also affects the molds. And the size of your mold determines how many ounces you can pour per layer so that you can avoid flash curing and bubbles and burning flowers. Unfortunately, this is something that you have to work on, that you have to practice and do some testing as you're going through it to kind of figure out what works best for you. I can tell you every part of my process, my exact room conditions, how many ounces I pour, and I actually do this in my how-to course, the Flower Preservation Academy, which I've got the link below in the description if you want. But you still have to do the work and test things out and practice. Which leads me into my third tip. Don't be afraid to experiment and fail. Believe me, it is so much better to experiment, learn how to use your resin, and in using your given work environment before you start making commissioned pieces. I spent 6 months making pieces, small pieces, big pieces, figuring out my room temps, how to mix, all of the things. I learned and made several pieces before taking on clients so that I knew I could deliver quality pieces. And I would also recommend experimenting with different resins, even if you've found the one. Back in 2022, there was a serious issue that came about with a popular resin company that forced a lot of artists to find a different resin provider. Since then, I refuse to only rely on one company, and I have been experimenting with multiple different resins so that I know what options I have should, God forbid, another resin issue happens and I need to switch. That way, if I do need to switch, I already know what resin I am using and what the protocol is, and it doesn't put me behind on all of my orders like the last catastrophe did. Now, the fourth tip is to get a temperature gun to ensure that your temperatures are accurate. We've already kind of talked a bit about how important temperature is with resin preservation. And in the beginning, I was really just working off of a room thermometer and believing that what that monitor said is what everything actually was. The room would heat up to 75 degrees Fahrenheit pretty quickly, and I just assumed that because the room was at the correct temperature, that the resin and the molds were also at that temperature. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and my resins and my molds were almost 5 degrees colder, which was the reason why I had micro bubbles in my pieces. Believe it or not, a few degrees makes a huge difference. And I had another artist recommend getting a temperature gun at that time, and I started checking the temps of my resin and molds when the room was hitting that temperature, and sure enough, I learned that they weren't the same temperature. So, it ended up being several hours later before they finally got to 75 degrees too. Once I figured that out, I waited to mix and pour until everything, the room, the molds, and the resin, was all at the same temperature, and the micro bubbles vanished. I also used the temp gun to check the temperature of resin after mixing to make sure it isn't too hot before pouring and I can avoid flash curing. I won't pour resin into a mold if it's more than 80, it has to be between somewhere like 80-85 degrees Fahrenheit. And from my third tip about experimenting, this is the temperature I have experimented with to know that keeping my resin around the 80 degree Fahrenheit mark is what avoids the flash curing. And my final tip, spend the money. It's 1000% worth it. Spend money on good resin. Spend money on good molds. Spend money on good PPE, especially if this is a business for you or you want this to be a business. You want to produce high quality pieces, so you need high quality supplies. In the beginning, I tried to make cheaper molds work, but in the end, I spent more money fixing the issues that those cheap molds were producing than if I had just bought the expensive molds to begin with. By the way, expensive is a subjective term, so I know everyone's idea is different, but you know what I'm talking about. And it's the same with resin. Cheap resin can have bubble issues, flash curing issues, ambering issues. It's just not worth it. I hope this video was helpful, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tips on growing your flower preservation business. And as always, if you ever have any questions about what I have discussed today or want to learn something specific, let me know in the comments and I can make a video for you. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time. Bye.